Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Mary Brosnahan believes every person should have a home, enough food, and the opportunity to have a decent job. And that's why she spent more than 25 years helping the poor, the hungry, the sad, and the homeless. She's the executive director of the Coalition for the Homeless, and I admire so much her passion, persistence, and saintly strength. And I use the word saintly because I have the you really, this is not just a job for you. This is a passion, isn't it?
It's a calling.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, and I work with so many talented people at the Coalition, and I think that's one of the reasons that the Coalition is seen as such a different place in New York. We do the frontline service, we also do the advocacy, and there's a very strong interplay between the two. But the people that I work with and the people that we help are what keeps us all going every day.
Is this, I mean, I didn't mean to ask you this, but it just came into my mind. Does this work have to do with your own inner beliefs and religious viewings?
Absolutely. I feel that the dignity of a person is fundamental, and that it's a very radical message that Jesus brought to earth, which is that you need to value each person as a person, to look past the outer surface. And at the end of the day, even though Jesus said the poor will always be with us, that doesn't mean that they have to freeze to death on the street. So there's the spiritual aspect, and then there's the practical aspect, which is, yes, there's death for poverty, but I think that homelessness is eminently solvable. And so giving people that dignity of a place to go to at night with a door that locks so that, like you and I, they can make themselves whole. That issue of home is very central to not just Christian tradition, but Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim. I think all faiths realize that affirming people and giving them that sanctity of a home is fundamental.
So you've been at this for now 25 years, more?
20 years, actually.
20 years.
Yeah.
And now today there are more homeless than ever.
Right.
So what are we going to do about this, and how do we handle it?
Well, it's a complicated situation, and that's why I love your show, because we can actually get into the details of why we find ourselves, again, on the brink of record homelessness here in New York and across the country. Here in New York, it's particularly troubling. I mean, right before Giuliani left office, homelessness was crossing the 25,000 person threshold, and that was front page news in the New York Times. People were astounded that for the first time in modern history we had gone past that 25,000 mark. That was right before 9/11. So when Bloomberg came into office, he inherited a mess from Giuliani, because Giuliani didn't invest in any of the things that we know work, that is the housing-based solutions. You know, Linda Gibbs was appointed DHS, Department of Homeless Services Commissioner, and she was able to get enough Section 8 vouchers, which are these wonderful federal housing vouchers, which are portable and allow homeless people and families to rent on the private market. And the numbers went down precipitously. They peaked at about 39,000, incomprehensible, and then they went down precipitously. But what has happened in recent history, Gibbs was promoted to deputy mayor, Rob Hess has followed in her footsteps, and now there's been this sudden ideological shift saying no more Section 8 for homeless families. Well, the results are just patently predictable. The numbers have increased. So now we find ourselves in the grips of this recession. And I'll just tell you that in July, August, and September of this year, each of those months set a new record for the number of newly homeless families that have come in the system. So, for instance, in September, over 1,400 new families came into the system. So I know we're sitting here taping this at the end of 2008, and we are on course to set a new record this month for total number of homeless families and children in the system. So we can talk about how that relates to the national backdrop and so on, but what I think is killing me and a lot of people is that why this shift? Why aren't we using these federal resources, especially at a time when the city and the state are so completely strapped, for avenues to ameliorate this suffering?
Well, wasn't it that the Bloomberg administration felt that too many people were getting into the system too easily?
Right. Or that it was a woodwork effect. In other words, if you make it too easy for people to access permanent housing through the shelter system by giving Section 8, that it will just increase the numbers. And in fact, they commissioned a study by Manpower Development Resource Corporation, and it actually showed that that effect was insignificant, that in fact, and you're probably familiar more than most with the really wonderful studies that were done by Mary Beth Shin at NYU and other studies that show that families that are given this type of housing support, long-term housing assistance through Section 8, don't come back into the system. So it's a win-win on every front. But again, you find that because a lot of these policy decisions are not being based in what's happening on the front line by people who have been on the trenches, so to speak, they're quick ideological decisions, and yet here the burden to the taxpayers is extraordinary.
It's so interesting because I worked with the homeless in 1969 in the Lindsay administration, where we had welfare hotels. We called them welfare hotels, and single SROs, the single room occupancy. And that hit the papers when a social worker put a family into the Waldorf to show what the city was doing for homeless people. And here we are with the same thing. So historically, though, as you move through the different administrations, it was always underlying fear that people were using the system.
Sure.
And why is that? It's a distrust of all these people. Oh, you can find some place to live, and they send them back to a cousin or somebody who's renting them floor space. I mean,
I think that if you feel that it's the get-overs are the majority of the people in the system, I mean, anybody who's worked, as you have on the front lines, of course they're bad apples. You know, they're bad apples on Wall Street, they're bad apples everywhere, but they really are such a minority. The vast majority of people that we're seeing at the PATH office or in our office are people who have exhausted any and every option. And a lot of the people that we're seeing, a lot of the mothers, let's be clear, these are mostly mothers with small children, don't have any options. Many times there's physical disabilities with either the children themselves, complicated situations. But at the end of the day, I think every New Yorker, or the vast, vast majority of New Yorkers, feel there has to be some place for people to go to.
So what is the answer? I mean, if you have Section 8, that was also not the greatest path because they had to find a landlord that was going to rent to them, right?
No,
Section 8 is a decent place.
Right. It's not a panacea, but certainly for people that have it, the vast majority are able to find places to stay. So I'm not saying that it's the be-all and end-all. Simultaneous to this, the mayor had a very ambitious plan to build or renovate 165,000 units of affordable housing. Now, again, that housing is for moderate, middle income.
I was going to say, what is affordable?
And so I think that it's wonderful, actually, that Sean Donovan now has been tapped by Obama to be the HUD secretary, because it's one of the few people here that is not an ideologue, super brilliant. I mean, and I'm so impressed that Obama picked him instead of just treating HUD as, you know, the throwaway appointment. I think the great things
doesn't seem to have any throwaway appointments.
Yeah, I mean,
that's what's so exciting and great about it.
It is exciting, and so, you know, against this national backdrop with Sean, you know, when you sit with Sean and say, we love this 165,000 unit plan, but how do we get some of that coming to homeless? I mean, even Ed Koch set aside 10% for new construction for homeless. And he's said, you know, if you give me the subsidies, this is the whole thing, to support that long term, he's not opposed to it at all. So
then the subsidies come from the federal government?
Either the federal or deeper subsidies that would come locally. You just have to make that commitment, as Koch did and was followed through with Dinkins. So,
but is there an ideal plan? I mean, do you have in your mind an ideal way to do the homeless families have so many problems. It's not just that they don't have a home frequently, right?
Well, what's interesting is that, you know, again, let's talk about the singles separate from the families. For the families, by and large, it is an affordable housing issue. Yes, the mothers don't have marketable skills. You know, the Coalition and other places have great job training programs to equip them with computer skills and so on. The job market itself is a different story.
Right.
Yeah, so, they need literacy skills, they need job skills, they need internships, they need to build up so that they can, and they need child care, frankly.
Absolutely,
so
and that gets cut. And then
exactly. So it is not a quick and easy, just build it in,
and it's but that's what I was trying to say. It's not a single issue. They need a lot of effort to go into it to make them really be able to do this.
They do, and so just looking at housing, though, is sort of that basic, you know, that if they can get that part of their life figured out and stabilized, they can get the kids to school and they can maybe find some child care.
So have there been studies of the impact of homelessness on the kids? Because people have been homeless now for many years. Has anybody followed the early families that went through the homeless system and
Yeah, what happens?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's followed them longitudinally, which would have been a great. It's very difficult to follow the families because they are so transient.
Yeah.
But certainly, there have been many studies done on what happens to homeless kids, and you know, the increase in psychological distress. Also, there was a recent study, I think it was by CUNY, that pointed out why kids aren't attending school, and homelessness was a big factor in that. In other words, why even kids at younger ages are missing out such significant portions of the school year. And we run this great camp up in Bear Mountain for homeless kids. About 300 kids go up every year, 3 sessions, 100 kids each. And one of the things that we struggle with is, you know, kids catching up with, they feel a sense of futility, that they've fallen so far behind their colleagues in school, but giving them, you know, just those basic reading, writing, all of that while they're having fun up at camp, so that, you know, they have regain that sense of hope.
So the Coalition is a statewide organization. And you not only are incredible advocates, right, and you do a lot of policy analysis and work, but you also, as you said, run these different programs.
Right.
How many programs are you running?
We have 12 different programs. We feed 1,000 people every night on the street, hot meals, which is great because we reach the hardest to reach.
And you go out to do it.
Yeah, we have 3 vans that go out, and that's a great volunteer opportunity for people because the vans are literally driven by the volunteers, and the food is handed out. We have one of the few places in the city, our crisis intervention program, where people can come in, and you can imagine it runs the gamut from, I've lost my ID and I need, you know, people need steel-toe work shoes, or women who need formula and trying to get into the shelter system. It really runs the gamut.
Is that open all 24 hours?
No, it's open during the week, and then we also have permanent housing programs, job training that I mentioned, in the after-school program in the camp for kids.
Is there a hotline for people who are homeless?
Well, our general number is 212-776-2000, and we're at 129 Fulton Street, actually, on the corner.
And that's another story.
Yes, on the corner of Fulton and Nassau, and you know, come down to our office, absolutely, and get help. It's easier for people to come, and then we can help
Or to
them.
call and volunteer.
Oh, yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
Now tell us about the building, because that's just an aside, but we have to do it quickly because we're going to run out of time.
Sure. We purchased a building on 129 Fulton Street. It's the Downtown Center for Nonprofits, and so the Coalition is on the top 2 floors, but Hamilton Madison House, which is a settlement house, has a wonderful daycare on the 2nd floor, which my son attended, along with a lot of other kids. And it's just a great environment because it's really, the people can come there, and what's interesting is that, like, the women who are in our job training program often need crisis services, and or come into crisis and need rental assistance. That's another program that we have that give people eviction prevention. Yeah.
Can't make the rent, you help them reimburse.
Yeah.
So ideally, if you had your druthers, it would be massive construction of housing for people who need it.
Yeah, we need a 2-pronged approach here. I mean, certainly we need to accelerate the New York housing, which is construction with services for people with mental illness, but then also on the other track, the permanent housing for families and the Section 8. We need to get past this ideological logjam and start freeing up some of those.
Who issues the Section 8, the state or the federal government?
The federal government, but then the city decides
who
it goes to. Yeah, it's limited, and it's been more limited under the Bush administration, but certainly Bloomberg has access to enough.
And we haven't mentioned the Housing Authority for public housing,
right?
Which is another question. And it seems to me the Bloomberg administration has been trying to make everything middle class,
right?
Basically,
middle income.
Yeah.
And also Tino Hernandez, who's just leaving the Housing Authority, did an amazing job, but at the end of the day, the books just don't balance. And so one of the things that they did was take over 6,000 of these precious vouchers and turn them over to the Housing Authority as a way to sort of balance their books. So that's another 6,000 opportunities for new housing.
But then there are also warehousing apartments, aren't they? And isn't there a drive to make it a more diversified housing complex up with more middle income or
Yeah, it is. And so, again, you know, we just have to face facts here. It's sort of like,
don't get it.
Yeah, if you're, you know, if there's nobody has water or food, you feed people who are dying of malnutrition first. So here you have record number of homeless families and children who are costing the taxpayers a huge amount of money. And then we have these resources that are being sort of meted out, you know, for this vision that, well, we want this to be more middle income. Well, at the same time, there are a lot of people who need help.
So how many people are there who are homeless? How many families do you think?
Well, the new numbers just came out. There are an astonishing 6,800 homeless families in the system, and for the first time, the Bloomberg administration did not release the numbers underneath that, how many adults, how many children. Over 15,000 children tonight. Probably we've reached a new record. We're trying to get to the bottom of how many are adults, how many are children, but I think that we've surpassed a new record.
So 6,800 families needing a place to live doesn't seem to be so hard to fill.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you know,
it's because the population is continuous.
Well,
is it always new people who come?
Well, this is the thing. Now with the recession, we're seeing this new influx of record new people coming in. So it's a huge problem. But again, if you take it systematically and sort of get off your ideological high horse and say, okay, we have this massive problem. How do we deal with it? You know, we could bring those numbers down precipitously.
And then we have other areas. We have women who leave with their children because of domestic violence.
Yes.
Then you have mentally disturbed people.
Yes.
Who need really more help.
More intensive help, yeah. And
does that tend to be more single?
It does.
People.
And I think one of the realizations, not only from the Bloomberg administration, but on the national level, is this new approach called Housing First, where you can bring people in with severe mental illness directly off the street, put them in housing, and then bring the services to them, because they've realized that, again, if the person's stabilized in housing, they're more receptive and able to take medication and follow through on whatever treatment plan.
How many homeless single people do we have, do you know?
We have about 6,000 in the system. It vacillates between 6,000 and 8,000 on any given night. And, you know, there's a whole problem at the front end of the system right now with how those people are being taken in and whether they're being given beds in a timely fashion, and then also another sort of scandal brewing out in Brooklyn where they're being put into boarding homes, which are completely inappropriate. And
what does that mean?
They call them three-quarter houses, and basically they're moving large numbers of people, many of whom have psychiatric disabilities, into these rooming houses, which are not designed, excuse me, to have such large numbers of people in them. In fact, the Daily News just reported over the past weekend that there was two-family homes that had 60 men living in bunk beds that was closed down because of illegal gas hookups and all types of fire hazards. So the idea that the administration is encouraging the not-for-profit providers to place people in these, you know, in the poorest neighborhoods, East New York and Bed-Stuy, that's touched off one flashpoint, and then they want to close down the intake center here in Manhattan and move it out to Bedford Atlantic. So that's a whole nother.
So how do you get there if you're homeless?
Well, this is exactly.
Yeah,
we'll bring you to testify in the court paper, in the court proceedings that we're going to be bringing in January.
What's the intake center for families?
It's up in the Bronx. But going back to the Bellevue Men's Shelter, you know, you couldn't imagine these things. They're going to turn it into a boutique hotel, and then move the central intake point, where the vast majority of street homeless are in Manhattan, out 9 miles out to Bedford Atlantic Armory. And the neighborhood out there is outraged because, you know, they're basically inviting all these street homeless, and the people in New York, Scott Stringer and many of the Manhattan leaders are up in arms because it's just going to lead to, well, it's going to lead to more street homelessness in our business district. So again,
no place to move people.
A system.
There was a story about housing for veterans, homeless veterans. That's a city project?
It is, and again, they were able to use or corral 1,000 of these new vouchers, Section 8 vouchers for veterans.
And mostly they were veterans from Vietnam.
Right, right. And what was interesting about the Times article, which just was the day that we're speaking, is that even the national advocates speaking out and saying, you know, New York may think that they're positioned well to deal with this crisis, but what we're seeing is that the veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan actually are becoming homeless much more quickly than their Vietnam counterparts. There was a delay, and we see much more alcoholism and drug problems. And now the new folks, unfortunately, that we're seeing have much stronger PTSD issues and are becoming homeless more quickly. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that the problem is much bigger than I think the city is anticipating.
And more complicated. I'm also in the Lindsay administration, Vietnam War. We had veterans that came back, and the welfare offices had lines around the blocks so long because they were homeless, they were jobless, they were everything. And of course they did have the large addiction problems. But these people now coming back really need those services. They need that attention.
They need the mental health
and
services.
So it needs to be, it's always seemed to me that this problem needs to be addressed by so many different agencies.
Right.
And I don't think they work that way, do they?
No. There is an interagency council on the national level who tries to coordinate. Unfortunately, there's no resources to coordinate under the Bush administration. But here in the city, you would think that, you know, one of the ideas with Linda Gibbs, then coordinating everyone. But you're absolutely right. The Veterans Affairs, Veterans Administration, there's so many people of goodwill in there, but it's such an unwieldy system to try to work through.
But it's also the same thing for families. I mean, you've got health problems, you've got job training problems, you've got school problems, and you've got no home.
Right.
And is the Board of Education an example of an advanced thinking about taking care of homeless children?
Well, I think that they're sort of the dog wagging the tail. I mean, again, the teachers on the front line or the social workers in the school are doing everything they can to keep that kid stabilized. But keep in mind that a lot of times the kids are spending 2-3 hours now to go from a shelter in a different borough now to try to stay in that original school and back and forth. And then the kid is not sleeping, probably not eating well, doesn't have any place to do his or her homework. And so, you know, by the time it gets to the Board of Ed level, it's hard to fix. So that's all. It comes back again to why is a home so valuable? Because it's a stable place, and for kids, stability is everything.
That's a very interesting thing, then, because you know where the family is, you can provide the services and do everything else. You mentioned a lawsuit, didn't you just now?
I did.
This all, I mean, the policies changed initially because of a lawsuit in 1981.
Right.
It was Callahan versus Carey.
Very good.
That's the governor, right?
Yep.
Right. Now, who is this lawsuit going to be?
Well, if indeed
the progress always follows, doesn't it? Lawsuits.
Well, this is the thing. You know, there's a big hoopla, and Steve Banks is so brilliant. He's our lawyer, and also leads legal aid, and you know, for 25 years brought this litigation for homeless families, and he managed to get an enforceable right to shelter for those families. And what better moment than right before this economic meltdown? And, you know, Bloomberg, oh, this was an albatross around our neck. We couldn't do the right thing with it. You know, a lot of sort of fig leaf there. But now if they do a plan in moving this shelter out to Brooklyn, I think that not only this separately, the community is going to sue, but, you know, we would have to sue on behalf of those homeless men who are not going to have reasonable access to life-saving shelter. I mean, in the middle of winter when it's dire.
But they don't even, and a lot of men don't even go to the shelters. That's another problem.
That's another problem, but what's interesting is that on the really cold nights they do. And so, like, for instance, at Bellevue Men's Shelter, you have hundreds of men additionally on these bitterly cold nights. Now, you and I would see that as a golden opportunity, right? Make it as easy as possible, get those guys to bed quickly, try to grab them while they're motivated. But instead, it continues to be a nightmare in terms of once you're there, getting to a shelter bed.
And then what's the busing towards that? What is, I mean, everything is so complicated that it's everything to discourage.
Well, this is the act of deterrence, and I think that that's what's most disappointing, that, you know, it seems to be stepped up on both the family and the single adult front. So you have, you know, your homeless individual man tonight, you go to Bellevue Men's Shelter, be waiting around for hours, you'll get bused towards Island, you may or may not get a bed till 2 in the morning, you'll get woken up at 5, you'll be told to go back and reapply. And what's really vexing is now, I explained in brief this 3-quarter house situation. Those men who were evicted or when the house was shut down are sleeping in chairs now at Wards Island because they're seeing, like, once you're out, we don't want to let you back in. So it is completely counterintuitive in terms of trying to get people in and get them help.
Have the churches begun not to take them in the way they used to?
Well,
or houses of worship?
Yes, the churches and synagogues. This was a huge move just a couple weeks ago where they've now, again, another way to get help on a cold night or any night is to go to a drop-in center. And then from there you can be transported to a church or a synagogue bed. And what the Bloomberg administration recently has closed down dozens of those church and synagogue facilities, and now has just, as of 2 days ago, released a new request for proposals where those drop-in centers will not be open at night, and you basically have to be referred to the drop-in center and then referred to the shelter bed. In other words, all kinds of diminution of those front-end shelter beds, and also more hoops to jump through, when everything has told us make it as low demand as possible on the front end and engage people.
I think it's time that we all try to, help you.
Okay, great.
And organize. And it seems to me that we're in a frame of mind now where we're supposed to be caring more for other people, that Obama's leading that kind of community
we have that
sense.
hope, yeah.
Why aren't more people helping and doing something?
I think that, and I think this is changing now. I think once people's hope is restored, that things can change, because, let's face it, 25 years later, people are like, is anything going to make a difference? You're saying there's more record homelessness now. How did we get there? And so just giving people some very specific things to do, like, Rabbi Robert Levine and others have been spearheading this effort, trying to get the Bloomberg administration to back down and say, this is part of our spiritual calling. We want to do these shelter beds. We feel that this is not just helping the folks that we're sheltering. This is helping our community. And so there's a great way to engage. Or volunteering at a soup kitchen. Go to the coalition's website. There's all kinds of advocacy things that we need help on. So federal, state, local.
So this is a very good point because we've come to the end of our program.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary, very much.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Please, for our viewers, I hope that they will call and come in and help with this problem.
We would love it.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.